Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL round number 4 overview and analysis video. This is a big one here. I almost titled this video the NACL semifinals because we are going to be covering the NACL semifinals in this video, but there is more to it than just that. We are also going to be covering, of course, the series that led in to the semifinals. We already got our winners finals in the previous video. We've covered everything in the NACL playoffs, in the NACL year up until this point. If you want to check any of that stuff out, it's up in the iCard right now. Up there is the video that came out just before the weekend, and of course, up there as well is the playlist for everything we've done on the NACL in the summer split. So far, that's the regular season, that's every other playoff series that we've covered, and so if you're interested in my thoughts and opinions leading into this series, that is a very good place to start, but of course, it's not required viewing or anything like that. It's certainly not something you have to watch in order to understand where I'm coming from, because today we are going to be going over the final two series before the finals, before Los Angeles here in the NACL. So I'm excited. I hope you are as well. Without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will very quickly be previewing the finals at the end of this video, as we will know our final two teams, the two teams that will be duking it out to be crowned the NACL champions here. And, you know, obviously we will know who is qualified for the America's Challengers alongside Dragonsteel after their win in winners finals by the end of this video as well. So quite a bit to talk about at the end, maybe a bit more than usual, but as per usual, most of this video will be spent talking about the two series we got this past weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. As you guys, I'm sure, are well aware of by this point, nobody has their extra lives still intact. We are exclusively dealing in the lower bracket in this video, and everybody is fighting for their lives. Our first series is to determine who is going to get the chance to play in the semifinals. Still an award up for grabs. It's a really fun matchup between the number 3 seeded FlyQuest Challengers and the number 4 seeded Supernova. I think this is kind of an expected matchup, at least for some people. It's not quite what I anticipated. I thought that at least one of the top tier teams in the NACL was likely to underperform, but no, we have our top 4 seeds making top 4, and 3 and 4 are going to be playing off for a chance to play against number 2. And the reason this is such an interesting matchup is because I think these two teams actually have very similar identities in terms of what they have been, which is inconsistently very, very strong over the course of this year. Of course, FlyQuest still coming off of being the defending champions. Like, they are still the defending champions here in the NACL. I know it doesn't feel like it because they haven't exactly felt all that dominant in the summer split, but they have 4 of the 5 pieces that won the NACL last split on this team, and so you absolutely feel like they can get back there. The problem for them has been their consistency in the back half of these games. They're dropping games that they really have no business dropping because it just hasn't felt like they are particularly cohesive right now. Their mechanical ceiling is still ridiculously high. You've got players like Surdy and Shaden and Sajed that are ridiculously talented in terms of the 1v1 or the 2v2, the early laning phase. Chime is one of my favorite players in the entire league. I truly feel he is like a top 3 or top 4 support in all of North America, let alone in the NACL. This guy is ridiculously talented and has been stuck in tier 2 for way longer than he should be. And then you've got someone like Bradley in the mid lane who, while he might not be quad for this team, they're not really asking him to be quad for this team anymore. I think he's really started to find a nice niche within the confines of the skill sets of the rest of this roster throughout the playoffs, and he has started to play a lot better, especially in the 1v1. His ability to play out team fights, I think, has really helped this team out quite a bit, and so you feel okay about FlyQuest. The concern for them has never really been the quality of the players on the team. It's always been getting the most out of those players on the team, which hasn't always been the easiest thing in the entire world. But for Supernova on the other side of this matchup, it's almost a pretty similar story. Like, you have incredibly talented players. You've got players with LCS experience in Kenvi, in Diamond. You've got some young up-and-coming potential stars, players like Toasty that I've really gone on, tangents about, players like Faisal that I've raved about in the past, Lens that I'm starting to rave about. He's had a great playoff run. You've got a lot of talent on this roster, but the consistency just has not been there. Really, with the exception of their win over Blue Water in the previous series, I haven't felt particularly good about Supernova's playoff run. I think I'm very fortunate that they had such a good series before going into this, because if they didn't, I honestly would be very concerned if they had just kind of barely beaten Blue Water once again in the previous round. I think I would be going here not feeling all that good about them, but they showed a lot of things in terms of growth and development towards the back half of games that gives me some more confidence that they're not just going to throw away the leads that they are able to get. But from a mechanical standpoint, they're one of the few teams I think that actually can challenge FlyQuest challengers 1v1 or 2v2 in a lot of these lanes. Like, Surdy is a mechanical god, one of the most mechanically talented players in all of the NACL, and Faisal is one of the only top laners that I think has like the mechanical upside to be able to match him game for game. Kenvi is one of the best junglers in the league. Shaden is not going to have an easy pass here. Toasty has been kind of a bit of a breakout star for me in the mid lane for Supernova, even if he hasn't been perfect over the course of this playoff run. That could potentially actually be a matchup that's in favor of Supernova, depending on how things go, and Lens and Diamond are certainly not significantly worse than Sajed and Chime. This is a very intriguing matchup because, again, a lot of the things that these two teams do right and do well, I think, are kind of shared between them. So we'll see what ends up happening. I think FlyQuest are definitely going in expecting themselves to win, not only because they're the defending champions, but because Supernova has shown some signs of weakness over the course of this playoff run. But the NACL is so high quality right now that anybody can really beat anybody, and FlyQuest is certainly no stranger to losing series that they expect to win. We have seen that multiple times throughout the year. So the only way to know how this series is going to end up going is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was FlyQuest Challengers. They are going to take game number 1 in this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was the exact game number 1 you wanted to see out of FlyQuest. You wanted to see them come out and just kind of be better in a lot of different areas, get a gigantic early game lead off of that big mechanical difference, use their strong mid-game macro to be able to separate themselves, and then, close it out. This was a really, really good performance. Honestly, much better than what we've seen out of FlyQuest in a lot of their series leading up to this year. This was very clean, which is not necessarily a term I've been constantly using for them throughout a lot of this split. For Supernova, this was a really bad game number 1. I think a lot of your flaws got really exploited here. Your lack of early game tempo was disastrous, and even though you did kind of draft the current, meta comp, if you will, I can't describe Cassante, Maokai, Corki as anything other than, the cookie cutter, what everyone else in the world is kind of playing right now. This has been a trio in every region. Even though you were able to get that in game 1 here for Fearless, it still ended up going really poorly. You lost a lot of pressure basically in every lane, and you just didn't have the damage to break through what was an unkillable Nasus by the mid-game, really even by the mid-game, and so this really wasn't all that great from Supernova, but we will get into that. Player of the game simply has to go to Shaden. I mean, this can't possibly go to anybody else. He was legit, almost 10 camps up on Kenvi after 10 minutes. It just felt impossible. The speed at which he was able to clear and the speed at which he was able to gain resources while also making sure that the Maokai could not play the game really at all. It just completely took Supernova out of it. I'm not saying Shaden solo won it. We're going to get into it. His laners definitely helped him out. Surdy had a phenomenal game on the top side. Bradley was unstoppable in the mid lane on this Nasus, but Shaden really was the cog and the resource, I guess, gatherer that ended up putting everything together as the brand. And he was doing a lot of damage in the back half of the game. Not nearly as much as this Crocodile on the top side of the map, but still a really good amount coming out from Shaden. And again, it's just the map pressure. It's the mid game that ended up being really impressive for me when it came to Shaden's performance. Typically speaking, we talk about him as a player that really benefits a lot from his surroundings and from his situation. I think that there are times where he can feel a bit inconsistent as a player because he's not particularly good at playing from bad states. He's not particularly good at playing from behind. That's a pretty common thing in a lot of up-and-coming junglers basically everywhere in the world right now, but when he is winning early, there is rarely a jungler that you are going to see that just destroys games as much as Shaden does. It's really fun to watch. A big shout out to Bradley. I mean, this Nasus was unkillable. People who don't watch a lot of the other regions might not be as familiar that Nasus is just gaining a ton of priority. I'm sure people who watch the LCS are at least a little bit more familiar with it at the current moment, but I mean, this has been a pretty standard pick in both the LCK and the LPL playoffs, so over the past couple of weeks. This champion is just in a much better spot than people were giving him credit for a couple of months ago. It's not like he's received any major changes. I think people are just realizing how unkillable he actually is. And the problem is that if you don't have the damage to break through him in the early game, you're giving him free scaling. And free scaling for Analyst is literally the end of the game. Bradley wasn't individually like crushing everybody with the damage that he was doing, but because he was soaking up so much pressure, because Toasty and Kenvi and Diamond were all spending so much time and so many resources trying to shut him down in the middle of the map and yet not getting anything for it, it ended up creating such an advantage for FlyQuest in and of itself, and that's really what separated them in this game. Surdy was amazing on the Renekton, ended up leading the entire game in damage. That was great. Sajid and Chime were very good in this game as well, but this was a crocodile game, this was a dog game, and this was a fiery man game. This was the top side of the map for FlyQuest really taking over, and that's a good sign. And then for Supernova, again, I get the idea behind some of the plays that you wanted to make. You basically sacrificed 2 of your members to try to get Toasty ahead in the mid lane, and it really, really did not work out. The Corki was never in a good spot. A lot of the plays you ended up trying ended up backfiring in a major way, just giving free gold over to things like the brand, and you were never really able to recover from that spot. Dud of the game could really go to any of Kenvi, Toasty, and Diamond, because all of them I thought were rather poor here in game number 1, but Toasty was the one they were putting resources into, and yet it just didn't really matter. He ends up going 0-6-1 over the course of this game. I do think that's indicative of just the lack of impact that the Corki had on the map, which is really not a particularly good sign. Again, a lot of the blame should land on both Kenvi and Diamond, the veterans on this team. Kenvi was down, like I said, like 10 camps or so at like 10 minutes, something ridiculous, just was completely out of the game before we had even entered the mid game. Diamond was spending all of his time and resources basically abandoning the Jhin, which in isolation is entirely fine. Jhin is one of those champions you pick because you want to try to isolate him. You can abandon him and he's still going to be useful, but that attention and those resources, when they go somewhere else, they have to be worth it, and they just weren't when you were sending it mid lane. Faisal was losing on the top side of the map. Surdy was just better in the 1v1. It just wasn't a good game from Supernova. There's honestly not even that much analysis I can give outside of that. They committed to a game plan and it failed on every level, and now they're down 0-1. The good thing for them is that it's only game number 1 in this series, and if they go out and win game number 2, if they can tie up the series, then you can start looking forward into the future, into the last part of this series, and say, okay, well, you know, we're not going to have another game like this. Nasus is now off the table. Brand is now off the table. Renekton is now off the table. That is a good sign for Supernova, and so hopefully they can come back in game number 2 with a slightly different game plan, but I'm sure Fly wants to be able to recreate this as cleanly as they possibly can. If they can generate these gigantic early game leads and punish Supernova for even trying to make plays, it's going to be a very quick series indeed. So are they going to be able to do that and get that dominant 2-0 lead, or is Supernova going to be able to tie this series up at 1 apiece? Well, the winner of game number 2 was FlyQuest Challengers. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they look dominant. And I really don't want that to get undersold. This has been a dominant start to the series for Fly Challengers. This has been about as good of a start to a top 4 series as you could possibly have. The momentum and the confidence that they are getting from these first 2 games is astronomical. Both of them are sub 26 minutes. Both of them have been absolute slaughters, basically from moment 1. This time it was a bit different. It wasn't taking these, you know, more active pieces and just utilizing them in the early game to get this gigantic lead in the jungle. This time it's double marksman, double like hyper carry, and just immediately getting both of them incredibly fed with some signature champions just sprinkled in the draft around them, like the Bard, like the Kennen in the top lane. What are you supposed to do here? I mean, this team is playing about as perfect as they played all year long, and that's including the version of them from the spring split. This is easily the best that Fly Challengers has played so far in the summer split, and I honestly don't even really have a ton of words. Supernova is getting absolutely obliterated, and, you know, we were concerned about them. I wasn't huge on their playoff series leading into this, or any of their playoff performances for that matter, including the spring split, but I still expected them to be a lot more relevant than they were in this game and through the first 2 games really at all. This is not close. This looks like, you know, a team that is in the upper echelon versus a team that's like in the middle of the NACL. That just kind of is how it feels right now. It doesn't feel like these 2 teams are on the same plane in terms of like what they are at the current moment. FlyQuest is unstoppable if they play like this. Player of the game is going to go to Sajed for me. It can't go to anyone else. Like, this guy got 2 pentas stolen away from him in this game on the Zeri. He deserves it. I mean, Bradley did most damage, I'm pretty sure, in this game on the Smolder, but that's basically a given when you draft that champion and actually win. That champion is just free damage throughout the entire game, but Sajed was everywhere, constantly being the primary damage and focal point of every single one of these 5v5s. He was getting picks in the mid game alongside Chime, alongside Shaden. It just was awesome. Like, this is the exact way that you want to get the most out of your, star young AD carry. I've not exactly been on the Sajed hype train nearly as much as some other analysts. I've been looking at some other AD carries in the NACL as a little bit more, I guess, like LCS ready. Someone like Scary Jerry, I think, is just a bit more LCS ready than Sajed is. It's not the same situation as someone like Masu last year, where he just came in and was like, oh yeah, this guy should be in LCS. Like, he doesn't need to stay in tier 2 for long. I think it would do Sajed well to maybe have another year in tier 2, at least in terms of the consistency development and being like that stud hyper carry, which I think he can turn into, but he can still have performances like this. And if he's going to play like this is an LCS caliber performance from the AD carry. He's lucky that he has such a good team around him, but he was the star of the team in this game, and he deserves all the credit for it. Bradley was amazing on the Smolder. He got super fed and, again, topped the damage charts because that's just what Smolder does. Bradley is really locked in. I think he's been better in the playoffs for this team for sure than he was in the regular season. Shaden and Chime were both great facilitators, both of them going deathless. Do you know how hard it is to go deathless on Vi in a game? Like, it is not an easy feat to just never die as Vi, because there are so many ways for that champion to get caught out, for, Vi to be in a bad position, and yet Shaden continues to dominate this jungle matchup. Chime on Bard. I mean, what do you want me to say? He's called Chime because of Bard, and he picked Bard and dominated on Bard. Like, it's just, you know what I mean? Like, Surdy was good on Kennen. It's just FlyQuest winning everywhere. They're making quick work of these games because they are just absolutely obliterating Supernova in the 1v1 matchups, getting super fed, and not being able to lose any skirmish for the rest of the game. It's the simplest formula you could possibly concoct, and it's working to perfection. But for Supernova on the other side, this sucks. Like, you do not look particularly good in this series. I hate to say it. I'm not entirely surprised that FlyQuest is just coming out and just dominating and being better in a series like this. I wish I was more surprised, but this is the upside of a team like Fly, and Supernova is unfortunately just the punching bag here today, and they just don't really seem to have it. Dud of the game for me, once again, very similar to Game 1, could go to basically anybody. I think that you could really make a strong argument for anyone on Supernova because they just weren't very good here in Game 2. I'm going to give it to Kenvi. The jungle disparity in this series so far is a big negative in favor of FlyQuest, or a big positive, I guess, in favor of FlyQuest, a negative for Supernova. It's just not been very good. Kenvi has been completely outclassed by Shaden, by Bradley, by Chime, by everybody else making macro decisions on the other side of the map, and he has not been able to do anything. I'm a big fan of this Sejuani pick. I think it's very valuable in the meta right now, but there was just literally nothing that he could do on this. And if you're pairing it up with something like Yone and Neela, like, they require that Sejuani to be in a good spot in order to do anything as champions. And so when Kenvi played really poorly at the beginning of this game, it was just over. There was no way to recover it. Toasty and Faisal were able to do some damage, but most of that was completely irrelevant. Lens and Diamond were not very good. I mean, FlyQuest's, draft goal was clearly to take away some AD carries to push Supernova onto something they weren't comfortable on. Neela ends up coming out here in Game 2. They have to play Neela Tarek in game number 2. That's really not good, and it didn't work out. Diamond was pretty horrible in this game. The Tarek just didn't actually do anything. You can't match the pressure or the roam priority of the Bard, and you're kind of hoping that the team fight combination ends up elevating it, but by the time they end up getting to that part of the game, the Tarek just melts to all the damage on the other side, the double hyper carry on the other side, and so that champion ended up being useless. No way Neela's ever going to do anything in this game. She dies the moment that she tries to press a button. Toasty can't do anything. Faisal can't do anything. It's not good. Like, Supernova looks pretty bad through the first 2 games, and they're going to have to step it up if they want a chance to not get swept. This is en route to be a really fast best of 5 here, a really easy win for FlyQuest if they can just carry this momentum into game number 3 once again, but they're not done yet. Supernova's not done. Obviously, they have to win 3 in a row against FlyQuest to move on and to keep their season alive. That's a pretty tall task, but that's all got to start in game number 3. If they can win game 3, then you can start thinking about game number 4, but are they going to keep this series alive, or is Fly going to close this out in an incredibly dominant 3-0 sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Supernova, they are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series by still staying down 2-1, but very much staying above the water in this one. And this was another dominating game. It just was kind of on the opposite side this time. It's been very fun to watch. All 3 of these games have been very fast, very quick. Whoever gets an early game lead, they run that thing into the ground, and the game is just over. It's been very interesting to kind of try and track, I guess, because it's a very interesting development of the meta. It's not exactly what we've seen from a lot of the other regions. Even from the NACL, we've seen a lot of comebacks. We've seen a lot of, games coming down to objective fights and 5v5 team fights. Snowball is still very much a part of the meta. If you're able to win early, you have such a huge advantage in terms of transitioning that into the mid game, but it's certainly not something that is unbeatable. But at least in this series, it definitely feels like it is a bit unbeatable to come back from those big early game deficits. Supernova was really strong in the bot lane. I think that's where you have to look first when it comes to their success in this game. Lens is a very easy choice for player of the game. The Caitlyn was just so dominating. They were able to get tower, I think pre-10 minutes, something ridiculous like that in the bot lane. Then they were then able to move the Caitlyn, the Lux around to multiple parts of the map and just start to pressure there as well. They just compounded that gold lead over and over again. They were able to kind of guide Aurora and Olaf into these really good positions. And then in the late game, it just was impossible to try to face that. Caitlyn from long range was poking out your tanks like Leona and Amumu and Ornn before the fight even started, and Aurora was picking off your backline as the fight started. And so there really weren't a lot of avenues or ways for FlyQuest to be able to get back into this game, and I think that that is just good execution from Supernova. I really like this draft. Skarner in the jungle, I think, is much stronger than he is in the top lane at the current moment. I think some LCS teams maybe found that out the hard way over this past weekend, but I digress. We got to talk about this game. I think this is just a generically very strong draft, especially in Game 3 of Fearless, for all of these champions to still be up. FlyQuest didn't put nearly as much of a priority on taking away AD carries early on in this draft. Well, they did. They still banned the Kalista, the Ashe, the Ezreal. They pick up the Kai'Sa, yada yada. But Caitlyn was left up, something that wasn't available to the Supernova team in the previous game, and obviously they were more than happy to take the Caitlyn Lux and try to play for that snowball, and it absolutely worked. When the enemy team is putting a lot of time and effort into taking away a certain player in draft like Lens, for him to still be able to show up and show out and be the player of the game, it's a very impressive feat. Diamond obviously deserves a lot of credit for it as well. His Lux was really good, but it was the duo in the bot lane that really created some problems. Toasty was the other player I really wanted to shout out. Aurora is just one of those champs where if you can get her to the part of the game where she's really strong, it's basically untouchable at the current moment. There's really no way to stop Aurora from engaging on you 2 screens away and just blowing up your carry. It just kind of is what it is, especially if you are just like randomly farming out the mid lane, because that's where you are in the most danger in most of these cases. Of course, I still stand by my take on Aurora, which is that she still is a lot weaker early than people are giving her credit for. She's not this auto-win champion. You do have to guide her through the part of the game where she is a lot weaker, but if you have Caitlyn Lux on this team and a Skarner that is playing active, yeah, you can get Aurora to the part of the game where she can start doing a lot for the team, and that's what she did. Faisal was good, Kenvi was good, but this was a bot lane focused game for Supernova, and that's a good sign. FlyQuest has very much been investing into taking away Lens and Diamond, and they couldn't quite do that here in Game 3, and they kept their hopes alive because of it. But for Fly, definitely not the worst thing in the world. You've been dominating this series up until this point. To drop Game 3, even if you were not in a particularly good position, it's not the worst thing in the world. I continue to be a big Amumu hater. I mean, say that I'm crazy, I don't know. Shaden's gonna get dud of the game for me. I just don't like this Amumu pick. I like it a lot more in the NACL than I do in the LCS. I think it's completely unjustifiable right now in the LCS, at least in terms of the priority. I'm not trying to say the champion is unplayable. What I'm trying to say is that, picking it over Sejuani is just weird. It's something I don't understand. Like, this being the Maokai answer in the LCS very much confused me. Even if it did have results, I don't think a lot of those results were because of the Amumu by any stretch. And in the NACL, again, it's more justifiable because of Fearless. When you have things like Maokai and Sedge taken off the board, Amumu is going to rise in, popularity. It is going to rise in priority, but why are you picking things like Leona with it? To me, one of the big benefits of having something like Amumu in the jungle is that you can afford to go something like Renata in the bot lane and play for the 2v2 and just allow Amumu to be your primary playmaker. So don't really love that idea. It's just a lot of setup for a double hyper carry comp. It's kind of similar to what they wanted to play in game number 2, but they just didn't have the resources in the early game to give the Azir and the Kai'Sa in the same way that they did in game 2. And a lot of that is just because they didn't have that jungle pressure. Shaden wasn't all that valuable on the R5 Amumu. The Ornn, not really doing much. The Leona, not really doing much. A lot of the engaged threats in this game just couldn't get off the ground. Bradley wasn't really able to scale up because by the time he was supposed to be strong on Azir, by the time he was actually supposed to be able to influence the game, he was going up against an Aurora who could just pick him off from 1,000 yards away. You know, Sajed was fine, I would say, overall on the Kai'Sa. This is a bit of an AD carry duel at the current moment, but a lot of those stats were rather inflated from that final fight, breaking open the base. But generally speaking, this is the most important game that Supernova has had in a while. Don't get it twisted, their backs are very much still up against the wall. They are not out of the woods just yet, but they have proven that they can beat FlyQuest, and especially with 30 champions now off the board, you know, it's never impossible to have some sort of comeback victory. Supernova has already shown that they can beat Fly, and they can beat them convincingly, but they're going to have to do it 2 more times, and once again, that's going to have to start in game number 4. You're not worried if you're a FlyQuest fan after game 3, but if they lose 2 in a row, now you're going into a Silver Scrapes. Having lost the last 2 games with no momentum, with no confidence, that is the situation that you need to avoid if you are FlyQuest. If Supernova can get there, they're going to be a very dangerous team, but are they going to be able to get there, or is Fly going to show that game 3 was a bit of an outlier? Well, the winner of game number 4 was FlyQuest Challengers. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to the semi-finals to take on Fear X Starforge. Of course, we will cover that series in just a few moments after we wrap up this game number 4, but this was a great series from FlyQuest. About everything you could possibly ask for was done from this team. They just showed up and played some of the best League that they have played all year long. A couple of their players, I think you could make a really solid and strong argument that this is the best series that they have played in the summer split, like pretty clearly, specifically the middle of the map here, which we will definitely talk about, but overall, this makes me feel a lot more confident and a lot more interested in FlyQuest moving on than I was going into this tournament. So congrats to them. Really happy with what they showed here for Supernova. It's obviously a pretty unfortunate way for your year to end, but I think top 4 is honestly a pretty good result, all things considered, for Supernova. I know that feels like a bit of a cop-out because I think this team did want to do better than this. I think there were, you know, some thoughts that they could get top 3 or even push for top 2, but I think top 4 is genuinely not that bad of a result for a team that has a mid laner who never played before this year. You have, you know, a couple of LCS veterans, but, you know, players that some people had given up on. Lens was an acquisition mid-year. You go through a big kind of transition there. Faisal was obviously somebody that was really highly prioritized, but FlyQuest wanted to move into a different direction in this year, and so you know, I love the Supernova roster, but there were a lot of things pushing back against them. Obviously, last split's playoff performance is a good indicator of that. I'm not saying that that was a bad team. They got historically unlucky in terms of the teams they had to play in the playoffs in spring, but turning that into a top 4 in summer, that's really not all that bad. This is a pretty good result, all things considered, I would say, for the organization. But for FlyQuest, player of the game for me is going to go to Bradley in the mid lane. I very much considered him for player of the series as well. Couldn't quite give it to him. I didn't think he was quite the game breaker in a lot of these games that maybe you would want, but he was generating gigantic leads, and quite frankly, he mega outplayed Toasty in this series, which is something I didn't really anticipate. I thought that if Supernova were going to be able to win some games here, that it was going to be through Toasty, through this mid lane matchup, because I do think Toasty's just been better than Bradley over the course of this year and over the course of this split. Toasty has really impressed me, but this playoff run had a couple of hiccups along the way, and Bradley was definitely the biggest of those hiccups. He was amazing in this series, and there is definitely a strong argument that he was the best player for FlyQuest. I'm not going to make that argument. My player of the series is going to go to Sajed in the bot lane. I just felt like he was more consistently a dominating carry than someone like Bradley was. He was still really good here in game 4, but I would argue that this was maybe his weakest game of the series. That game number 2 was just so exceptional from him and from everybody on the team. Again, it wasn't just him. I'm not trying to make this like a one-man show type of conversation, but I just was really impressed with Sajid. Typically speaking, I give a lot of credit to Chime on this team. I think there have been some times in the past where I've maybe given too much credit to Chime in terms of the things that this team is doing, but I certainly can't take anything away from his AD carry in this performance. Shaden is also a player that you have to point out. I think if he had played even slightly better on the Amumu in game number 3, he is guaranteed player of the series here, because the Nidalee in game 4 here and his game 1 performance were just so exceptional. And honestly, I think there is a strong argument to be made that he is actually the player of the series, but I ended up erring on the side of caution just purely off of that game number 3. But again, great series from Shaden. Going into a player like Kenvi, it's not the easiest matchup in the entire world. Kenvi is a very good player, somebody who has been a top tier NACL jungler all year. I don't think he's been quite as good in summer as he was in spring. I think losing someone like Shoji, who really makes his jungler look like $1 million, basically in any circumstance, definitely played into that, but the team had more success playing through the middle of the map with Kenvi on more facilitators. You know, I'm not trying to say it was a bad thing, but overall, I think Shaden beating someone like Kenvi so handily, I would say throughout most of this series, is incredibly impressive. This guy had an LCS job at the beginning of the year for a reason. Same thing with Surdy, who was supposed to be on Evil Geniuses, if you guys forgot, before they pulled out of the league. Surdy was really good here. Faisal was pretty solid as well, I would say, especially towards the back half of this series, but Surdy was more than fine. And again, when you're getting great performances out of players like Shaden and Bradley and Sajed, you know, that's it. Like, FlyQuest is going to be able to win a series like that. And they looked awesome. Again, they looked so complete as a team. Their wins were so dominant. They looked very clean. This is the best they have looked in all of summer, no question. If they had played like this in the regular season, they would not be in the predicament that they're in. We just have to hope that they're able to keep their form. But for Supernova, on the other side of this, it was an okay performance. Again, I don't really want to tear them down too much because this wasn't a particularly back and forth best of 5. This was very much them getting obliterated, being given a game in game number 3, and then just losing it in game number 4. They just weren't as good as FlyQuest, and I think that just kind of emphasizes the tier gap that we kind of talked about between the top 3 and everyone else. And that's not to say that Supernova is bad by any means. I still think that this is the best of the rest in terms of the NACL, but the top 3 are just juggernauts right now. They are all LCS caliber in terms of, you know, what they can put out on their best days, and Supernova just wasn't quite up to the task of being able to handle that. I still think you have to look back on this year as a major success for this team and for this org, considering how they came into the year. Remember, they were relegated at the end of last year. They end up getting back in because the NACL does some team swaps and, you know, some teams pull out, some new orgs come in, and so Supernova gets their spot back, and they make the most of it. They actively go out and get a really strong roster, get a couple of former LCS players and some high-profile NACL players. They make changes in the middle of the season when things didn't end up working out in spring. They brought in Toasty and Lens from Fear. You know, you keep players like Faisal to develop on, and all of it does kind of work out. This team was very competitive over the course of this year, and they really were an NACL powerhouse, and that's basically everything you could have wanted to hear at the beginning of the year. You had players like Faisal that were great and continued to develop. I thought he arguably played better for Supernova than he did for FlyQuest for parts of last year. You have someone like Toasty that you picked up in the middle of the year that I have been saying is like the next NA mid laner to kind of come through the system and really break through. We've been talking about kind of waiting for the next mid laner to take over the NACL. I think he could have a very similar impact in year 2 to a couple of the players that we've seen before. I think he could be like an APA style immediate impact in the LCS if he were given an opportunity. I don't know if he's there quite yet, but I think he will be there next year. And honestly, like, the carry potential of Toasty is incredibly high. I was incredibly impressed by his rookie year. Lens was way better for me this year than he was last year. I was way more impressed with his ability to play within the structure of a team and not really necessarily just kind of fade into the background. That was always a bit of a concern with him, is that he was kind of one of those AD carries that was a bit too much of a team player and would take too little of a role to take over the game. It's nice to see him actively put his foot on the gas, and Kenvi and Diamond both showed why they should be considered near the top of their positions and why they should be considered for the LCS in certain circumstances. Like, this was a good Supernova team. They just, again, didn't have enough firepower, and it is what it is. Toasty being not so good in this series, him getting dud of the game here in Game 4 was a big reason for that, but you know, Kenvi also lost pretty hard in the jungle matchup. Basically, everyone else lost in the first couple of games, but the middle of the map wasn't necessarily in their favor throughout a lot of this series, and that's an unfortunate way for it to go. But again, it's really hard for me not to look at this season as a success for Supernova. It's really hard for me to look at this as anything other than a good year for them, considering what they started with, considering how they entered the league this year and what the expectations were. I think they met it pretty favorably. And then for FlyQuest, like we said, they move on now to take on Fear. We're going to talk about that series in just a second, but this team has a chance to continue their upward momentum. They look the best that they have looked. I can't reiterate that enough. And if they can carry that momentum in, they very well still have a chance to become the champions here in the NACL. But now it's time to move on to our second series of the video and our semi-finals here in the NACL. By the end of this series, we are going to know the two teams that not only qualify for the finals, that qualify for Los Angeles, but also the two teams that qualify for Sao Paulo and the Americas Challengers Tournament. So, a lot on the line for these two orgs, and let me tell you, both of them very much want to be getting that spot in the top two next to Dragonsteel. It's the number 2 seeded Fear x Starforge taking on the number 3 seeded FlyQuest Challengers. We just saw Fly play. I don't feel like I need to preview them all that much. We already did that in the previous series, and you got a good idea of how they've ended up playing over the course of this video, I would say so far. But for Fear, what I really like about Fear and what I think makes them so successful at this level is that they are really good at punishing mistakes. I think that is what they do at such an elite level that other teams just can't really deal with. You're playing in Tier 2 here. You're not exactly going to see the cleanest gameplay, even from the best teams. Like, Dragonsteel is great, but they're not, like, perfect. Even at the top of the LCS, you're not seeing perfect gameplay. Even at the top of the LCK, you are very rarely seeing perfect gameplay. And so, if you're really good at identifying when the enemy team is putting themselves in bad positions and constantly capitalizing on that, that is such an advantage for a team, and that's what I think Fear x Starforge does at a high level. Of course, they have a very clear game plan. Their macro is incredibly solid, and they never really feel like they're out of games because they're all such good team fighters in the back half of the game. That being said, they're not perfect. This isn't like the most dominant team in the entire league or anything like that. They're not going to obliterate you pre-15 minutes and just kind of roll their way to victory like we saw in games 1 and 2 from FlyQuest in the previous series. It's just not really how they like to play. That's not to say they can't. They're all incredibly talented in terms of their ability to 1v1 or 2v2 early on in these games. It's just not really been something that they've prioritized as a team. They are much more willing to try to play out the early game a little bit more passively, play things that are a little bit more scaling oriented in the middle of the map. A lot of AD carries in the middle for a Blaze Olive, and typically kind of rely on him to be a primary damage dealer in a lot of these 5v5s. That's worked out incredibly well. It's a very difficult style to stop unless you are just straight up mechanically better than the other team, unless you can get these gigantic leads in the early game. Because if you can't jump out to these big leads early on, then Fear is likely just going to beat you from neutral. That is the big problem with them, and that's what makes them so difficult for specifically NACL teams to stop, and that's why I think they have a good matchup against FlyQuest Challengers. We've already seen this matchup in the tournament in upper bracket round 2. Fear definitely took care of that series. They were able to get to winners finals off of that series, and there's really no reason to believe that it will be any different going into this semifinals. I think Fly is in better form, though, especially coming off of that Supernova series. I just think, generally speaking, this is the best form they've been in. You would imagine that this org and these players are going to be pretty hyped up to try and defend their title here in Los Angeles and try to go to Sao Paulo as the Spring Split champions. I think that that is definitely something that is going to be on their mind. So I certainly don't think that you're getting a weaker version of Fly than you got in the upper bracket. You probably are getting a stronger one, but that being said, I still think Fear is probably your favorite going into this, so long as they execute their game plan, which they have been so good at executing all year long. But of course, the only way to know whether or not that will be the case is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Fear x Starforge. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. Great game 1 here from Fear. This is exactly a perfect example of what I was talking about in the preview, where we're talking about a team that might not be the most, like, dominating in terms of their map presence. They might not be up, 10,000 gold by the end of the game, but you can rely on them to make the right play and to catch out the enemy team in their bad situations in the late game, and then they're just so clinical at turning that into basically an instantaneous end, and that's exactly what happened here. You get a pick on the Smolder, you get a pick on the Kai'Sa, and all of a sudden it's a 5v3 crashing into the base when you probably should have just lost an inhibitor, and that's the game. It's over. Like, it really is that simple in a lot of these instances, and I think that there is a lot of benefit to that. Player of the game for me in game 1 is going to go to XU in the jungle. This is a masterclass in how to perform well on Sejuani. Again, I will continue to bang the Sejuani drum because I just think that this champion is so undervalued in North America right now. We're seeing things like a Mumu and Maokai take precedent over Sej, and I just don't necessarily agree. I think Maokai is better once you get to these 5v5 late game team fights. I think his objective control is the best in the entire game by a pretty large margin, but Sej is so much more versatile in terms of how you can play her early on because you can actually play her a little bit more aggro. You can go on the attack with something like Sejuani, and you just aren't rewarded nearly as much for doing that on things like Maokai, and so I just think that Sej is in a better spot than people are giving her credit for right now, and XU really coming out and showing that to be the case here in game number 1. He was everywhere on the map. He was the one who got the pivotal pick on Bradley that basically ended the game in the top lane. That was really huge, but also getting a Blaze Olive into a really good position on this Corki. We talked about it for Fear. Their primary goal, their primary mission in a lot of these games is to make sure that the Corki is in a good position, to make sure that, a Blaze Olive is in a good position and can carry a lot of these late game team fights. ABO was very good in the back half of this game. He had a ton of gold and honestly was just way more useful than the Smolder on the other side of this matchup, and a lot of that to me was XU putting him in a really good spot. But that's not to take anything away from ABO. I thought he had another very good game here in game number 1. I've been on record saying that he is pretty clearly the best mid laner in the NACL right now. In terms of performances, he might not be the flashiest, but he is definitely the most consistent, and even at times he definitely is the flashiest. I'm not trying to take anything away from his highs. I just don't think that his name is thrown around nearly as much in terms of these like breakthrough prospects because he's had that LCS time, because he actually spent multiple years in the LCS. I don't think people view him in that way, but this guy came back to pro this split and is absolutely dominating. Has been a massive pickup for this team. This mid jungle definitely pulling their weight in game number 1. Philip continues to be really good on things like Cassante. Very interesting that Fly puts such a high priority on Renekton as the takeaway here. In draft, it means Philip will not be getting his signature champion in this best of 5. Not entirely surprising to see that, but Philip's really good at a lot of other things. Cassante has been a big pick for Fear over the course of this year, and he continues to make the most of it. I actually really like Instinct on Ziggs. I think they play around like weak side bot really well because they like to funnel that pressure in the middle of the map, and Instinct is really good at playing side lanes, and so you end up in these situations where Winsome can be a lot more aggressive with XU, and Instinct is going to be just fine in the bot lane, something that a lot of teams, it's a luxury that they're not afforded in a league like this. Typically speaking, AD carries are much more comfortable when they are the high damage carries of the team, but I think Instinct is one of the rare ones at the top level of the NACL here that actively can just function very well on his own. So Fear just playing to their team's strengths and playing to their own understanding of the game. This is perfection from them in game 1. For Fly, it wasn't horrible. You didn't get destroyed or anything like this wasn't a Supernova game number 1. This was a FlyQuest game number 1 where they just weren't able to get a big enough lead to avoid the mistakes that they were making in the mid to late game. This more so felt like a regular season FlyQuest game where they were in an okay spot. You had gold on the Smolder. You actually had a ton of gold on the Smolder. You had gold on the Kai'Sa, and you have a Maokai. You have a Rel. You have a lot of setup, a lot of opportunity here. You just have to stay patient. You have to not get greedy, and unfortunately, they just can't help themselves in a lot of these instances. Bradley is going to get my dud of the game here because his catch, his pick, lost the game instantaneously, and I understand that that's not necessarily fair because a game is more than just one play, but that was a pretty devastatingly bad play. I mean, Sajed got caught as well on the Kai'Sa, but I thought Bradley was way more relevant to the kind of narrative of the game overall. And his pick was more influential, and it certainly was a bit of a problem for this team to have lost both the Smolder and the Kai'Sa right before a gigantic base push. It takes, the game, essentially, it ruins the game for them. They can't come back from that point. Surdy didn't exactly play well. Shaden on the Maokai can't really do anything in the mid game without any of his carries really being able to dominate. Chime was fine on the Rel. I actually don't even think Chime played all that poorly, but it's just one of those situations where it felt like FlyQuest was a little bit less than the sum of their parts in this game, and that can't really be the case going into the back half. They have to get back some of that mojo they just built in the Supernova series. Regular season FlyQuest cannot show up to this matchup. They're not going to be able to win, and so a pretty important turnaround necessary for them in game number 2, but if Fear can get that 2-0 lead, we already saw in this video what that can do to the enemy team. It makes their life significantly harder, so a big game number 2 coming up, but who's going going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was FlyQuest Challengers. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece. And yeah, we've got a back and forth series on our hands here today. This is the FlyQuest we were hoping to get in this series. This was a destructive and aggressive early game from them, mostly coming out of the bottom of the map that they were then able to just snowball into an unstoppable victory. Again, this is really, really similar to what we just talked about for them in the Supernova series. And so, honestly, there's not a lot of new stuff that I can say about them in this game that I didn't say about them in the previous series. They did it through a couple of different avenues than maybe they did in the previous series. It wasn't Shaden and, Sajed in the late game. It was really a lot of the playmakers like Chime and, Shaden was really good, but like Bradley really stepping up in the mid lane. And I think that really was kind of the determining factor for Fear. You just draft this Ivern, Azir plus Kalista comp and you don't win early and all of a sudden the game's out of your hands and it just is what it is. Like you have to accept some of these losses, especially to a team like FlyQuest. But I think the most important and most interesting thing coming out of this game is I think we've really locked in the roles for these teams in this series. I think if games are relatively neutral going into the later half, I would heavily favor Fear in those matchups. And FlyQuest's biggest advantage is their ability to just obliterate the early game. They already showed that off against Supernova, but it's very much coming to light in game 2 as well. If that continues to be the trend, then that's going to put a lot of onus on FlyQuest, and as long as they play like this, they'll live up to that. But player of the game for me in game number 2 is going to go to Chime. No brainer. I mean, this Blitzcrank was unstoppable, just constantly landing priority hooks in multiple different circumstances. It doesn't matter how safe you play if you don't have the opportunity to actually have all the information on the map, and that's the problem with having to play against a Blitzcrank from behind. When you are not in a good position going into something like that, you're just walking up hoping and praying that you don't get hooked over every single wall, because if you walk up to try and ward it, you just die. Like, it's really, really hard to end up being in that situation. The only thing that could really salvage it is if you can survive a Blitzcrank hook, potentially flash out and try to salvage yourself, but Senna can't do that. Like, that's not the position that she individually can be in as a champion. And so Blitzcrank really invalidates a lot of what Fear wanted to do in this game, and Chime obviously executed it well. He is one of the best supports in North America. I cannot stress that enough. It is an absolute shame that he is not playing after this year, as he has already announced. Or he announced that at the beginning of this split. He was like, this is my last split in competitive. I just think it's an absolute travesty with how good of an individual player he is, but he continues to show that off in pretty high pressure situations. Credit to Bradley. I thought he was really excellent in this game as well. Just constantly dodging in and out of these fights. Playing Ezreal is not particularly easy if you're not entirely familiar with him. Bradley clearly has a lot of experience on the champion, and he was kind of the primary damage dealer, I would say, throughout a majority of this game. Shaden was really good. Sajed was really good. Surdy was pretty solid on the top side on a Camille pick that has not been historically very good over the past couple of weeks in basically any league, as I've talked about. Camille has actually done pretty poorly in a lot of the playoff leagues that we've talked about on this channel, but it very much worked out here for Fly. Just a good game overall. And then for Fear on the other side, they just kind of got beat in the early game. Again, bot lane just kind of got disintegrated by this Blitzcrank. Winsome's going to get my dud of the game. Really not a lot you can do on the Senna the moment you get super behind. As I already talked about, his entire job this game was to walk up and hope and pray that he doesn't die when he's trying to establish pressure and vision on the map. And there's really no way to prevent that. This entire game plan from Fly was to make sure that Senna didn't scale out of control. I know a lot of people and a lot of teams are very scared of Senna as a champion. I think she is incredibly strong right now, but there are counters, and this was definitely one of them. The Kalista also never got off the ground. That bot lane got obliterated early on, and Instinct was put in a really bad spot. And having to play Kalista from behind is one of the most torturous experiences you can play in Pro, especially when you're going into things like, Blitz and Ezreal, where they're just like constantly pressuring you at all points in time. You have to be so conscious of where you are and where you jump in a lot of these circumstances. It's just really difficult to play out this game if you're Kalista or if you're Senna, and the bot lane being neutralized is a pretty big problem for Fear. It's not like XU or ABO or Phillip were doing all that much better on the top side of the map. It just was one of those games that ended up slipping away from Fear. But again, the game plan for them has become increasingly more clear. FlyQuest is very intent on trying to get these early game leads that they can just brute force and snowball out of control. They're not a bad macro team, but Fear is clearly the better macro team, or at least that's what my read would be. And so if you can just neutralize this early game aggression, if you can stop a lot of these negative plays from spiraling out of control in the early game, I still think you're going to be in a pretty okay spot. But FlyQuest has shown that they can get those early game leads. The question will be, can they do it on other champions? Blitz is a pretty easy champion champion to take advantage of some of those mistakes on, you need to be able to do it in multiple situations because you don't get that blitz for the rest of the series now. And so this is a really important game. Game number 3, very, very integral. As you guys know, I think game 3, when this series is tied up at 1 apiece, is the most important game of the entire series. Winning this puts you in a significantly better spot than losing it. Having to win both of the final 2 games is so much harder than only having to win one. So a must-win game, in my opinion, for both of these teams. Which one is going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FlyQuest Challengers. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in the first time for this series, 2-1, and they have established full tempo. They have now pushed Fear Starforge to match point. They can no longer lose a game. They are on the brink of moving themselves into the finals to get their rematch with Dragonsteel from the spring finals. That would obviously be massive for FlyQuest, but Fear is not out of it just yet. I'm going to be honest, this is a draft gap, and I don't really say that super often. I don't even really love FlyQuest's draft in this. I think Nidalee is a very feast or famine pick. I think it can work really well at this level, and obviously with Shaden playing as well as he did in this game, it definitely ended up working out, but I just think you limited a lot of your options on Fear. I don't really like Jhin mid. I like Jhin a lot as a champion. In fact, that's one of like my defining talking points when I talk about the LPL or the LCK or even the LEC, because so many fans seem so averse to Jhin as a champion, and I'm just not. I think he does so many things well. I think he's genuinely one of the best marksmen in the game right now, but what makes him so good is that you can really put him on an island, like put him in a bot lane matchup where you have an engaged support and just move that support around and try to play for your hyper carry. But when you draft him in the mid lane and you put him in the center of the map, you're not really drafting him to put him on an island. I get the idea behind it, but you really have to get this Jhin rolling if you want to make him work, and it just didn't end up working out in this game. But, you know, I'm a big proponent. I know a lot of people who follow the channel are pretty annoyed by hearing me say this a lot, but I'm a pretty huge proponent of, like, draft diff is overrated. I think, generally speaking, draft is 20 to 30% of the game, and you're still getting like minimum 70% from your in-game decisions, and I think that is significantly more important. You could have, you know, if you're the better team, like if you're T1 and you're taking on, I don't know, like Shopify Rebellion, like it doesn't matter what T1 drafts. In a lot of instances, they're going to win those games. Like you could have the worst draft in the world for T1, as long as it has a win condition, you can probably play it out. So I understand the conversation surrounding this game at least a little bit, but generally, I think that FlyQuest just played better, and they played towards their win condition, which was the Nidalee here, who's going to get player of the game. It's going to go to Shaden. You've got your hyper carry in this game in the Zeri. You've even got Jax for potential like backup, like split push kind of game plan here, but it didn't matter. The Nidalee just got super active in the early game. Shaden making that champion look like $1 million at the current moment. We've actually seen Nidalee really fall off in terms of both performance and popularity in the last couple of weeks everywhere around the world. People are just not really playing Nidalee anymore, but of course in a fearless format, she becomes a lot more attractive when you take out a lot of these more stable junglers like Maokai and Sejuani that can really shut her down and make the game more passive in a lot of instances. If you can get the game rolling, if you can play Nidalee and start throwing spears from Fog of War and doing 1 billion damage to Varus every single fight, then yeah, by all means, pick Nidalee. All of a sudden, it becomes a really high-value pick. So, Shaden continuing to look really good when he does get those early game leads. Everybody on FlyQuest looked good here. Bradley continues his hot streak. He has carried that over from the Supernova series. He has played really well, I think, through the first couple of games here. Sajed was really strong on the Zeri, was put in a really nice spot by a lot of the early aggression coming in from Shaden. Chime is very good on Braum. Surdy was fine on the top side. Going Deathless on Jax is really all you can ask of him. But generally speaking, for me, this was a Nidalee game, and it was definitely the focal point for what FlyQuest wanted to do, and for Fear, they just didn't really have an answer to it. They're pretty low mobility, all things considered. Jhin plus Varus plus Zyra, you don't really have a lot of options to be able to avoid poke. If they are going to be throwing out a lot of spears from Fog of War, which is what ended up happening in this game, and quite frankly, what the Nidalee plus the Lucian and even like the Braum to a smaller extent were able to do in this game is just kind of neutralize a lot of the damage that could theoretically come out from Fear. There was no way Varus was ever never going to get to play this game. Instinct is going to get dead of the game purely because, like, what is Varus supposed to do? He gets hit by one spear at the beginning of a fight, and he's down to half health, and now all of a sudden, it's over. Like, they can no longer actually play out any of these exchanges. I think you could say similar things about the Jhin. The Jhin was a little bit more, I guess, proactive, active on the map in general because he's in the middle. He's kind of thrust into a lot of these situations, but again, I'm really not all that in love with Jhin mid personally. I think it takes away a lot of the things that Jhin is good at. I don't think Winsome or Phillip or XU really did much this game. XU definitely got a bit out-tempoed here on the Zyra. Not all that surprising in this matchup, but still something worth noting. And then, you know, we already talked about it. Winsome, what do you do as Leona when your carries can't actually stand up and, like, do damage? You can't engage. You have to sit there and try to tank Nidalee spears. That's your job. Same thing for Aatrox, who just died at the start of every single fight. You just didn't really have any ground to stand on in this game, and I just don't really think you set yourself up for success. The lucky thing is I don't think you will do this again moving into the back half of this series. This has been one of the most consistently great drafting teams, not only this split, but, like, for Fear's existence. They've always been a team that's been willing to think outside the box and pull out some creative, you know, interesting strategies to win games. This time it just didn't really work out, and they're paying the price now down 2-1 in this series. They're not eliminated, obviously, but Game 4 is now a must-win for them because they are, you know, one game away from being eliminated. If Fear gets all the way to third place as the number 2 seed but can't get it done, it's going to feel so devastating for this org that feels like they are constantly so close to taking that next leap. But FlyQuest, like I said, now one game away from getting back to the finals and potentially trying to get their rematch with Dragonsteel from the spring split. Are they going to be able to close it out in 4? Or is Cincinnati Fear going to send us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 here in the semifinals? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Fear x Starforge. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 here in the semifinals. This is what we were looking for, a back and forth series, a banger of a couple of games coming in from these two teams. And neither one of them is seemingly willing to try to take their foot off of the gas pedal. This one was a bit more of a stomp, I would say, than game number 1, really from start to finish. This was Fear just entirely having control. That being said, you know, Fly's wins are going to look just a tad bit more dominant. It's their style. They are much more feast or famine in terms of how they play the game. It is really difficult for them to operate in good spaces when they are playing from a disadvantaged state, but Fear maybe isn't dominating these games as hard as FlyQuest would in these instances. It's just kind of the trade-off of the two different teams, and that's what makes this series so interesting to watch. I'm so fascinated in the dichotomy between these two teams going head-to-head because I do think it's coming out in every single game that we've seen so far in this series, and now we're going to a game 5, and it couldn't be with two more interesting teams. So let's go ahead and talk about game 4 before we talk about everything else in this series. In game 5, player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Instinct in the AD carry role here on the Jinx. This was a spectacular Jinx performance. He was the main carry in this game. They were constantly just waiting for, or FlyQuest was constantly just waiting for him to mess up and try to put himself into a bad position, and he just never did. He was always in the right spot in these team fights. His positioning was near perfect in this game. This is one of the most, I would say, complete, like, Jinx hyper carry, like, low mobility AD carry performances that we have seen in quite a while here in the NACL. Just no mistakes, like, constantly in the right place at the right time, never really getting caught out being too far forward, but still maintaining a ridiculous amount of DPS and staying aggressive in these fights. This was an elite performance from Instinct, and this is the exact kind of performance that they needed in a situation like this. It obviously wasn't a 1v9. I don't want to take things away from Fear in that regard, but this game becomes a lot harder if Instinct is not winning as hard as he is on the Jinx. I want to give a big shout out to Winsome and ABO. They're the other two players that I think are really worth mentioning in this game. Talia, for some reason, has, like, fallen off the face of the planet in terms of pick ban rate. I get that the champion just doesn't do, like, a ridiculous amount of damage right now. There are certainly, you know, more viable, like, hyper carry picks, especially because the meta has transitioned into your mid laner kind of being your carry in a lot of these comps, but Talia still offers so much flexibility, and it really opens up the opportunity to play a comp like Fear ended up playing in this game, which isn't exactly what we've seen in the current meta. This feels like something we would have seen in the spring split, something we would have seen in 2020 2023, and that's still very valuable. You still can get away with carrying a marksman out of the mid lane. It can just be in the bot lane if that's what you want to do, and having a Talia to move around the map and facilitate that, I think, is big. And it's not like this champion does no damage. She's still very valuable in a lot of these games, and I'm honestly a bit surprised that her priority has gone down so much over the course of the past few weeks. Winsome was really, really good this game on the Nautilus. Definitely want to see him on Engagers and on Playmakers the rest of this series. It feels like this team is just way more comfortable in those circumstances, playing around Winsome being kind of the go button for them. He doesn't need to always be Peel. He was Peel for a lot of this game as well, but he can be the go button every single time for this team. He has a great instinct for that. A pun not intended, but very funny. Philip, XU, they were both good. XU in particular, I thought had a really good game on the Vi, but Fear just, once again, playing into their win condition of just being smarter in the back half of games, basically, than anybody else in the NACL, being very clinical and understanding who they need to play through, who their win condition is. Oftentimes it was ABO, but in this game they opted in to it being Instinct, and he paid it out 100%. So really happy for Fear. And for Fly, obviously not the ideal game for you. Definitely wanted to close out this series. You did not want to be moving into a game number 5 against Fear, because anything can happen in a game 5, and you certainly didn't want to blow away picks like Brand and Tristana on a game that you were just going to lose anyways. That's not entirely ideal, but dud of the game to me came pretty easy. This one is unfortunately going to go to Chime in the support position. I just did not think the Rakan was good, which is very strange because this is maybe his most consistent champion over the course of his pro career. I remember really hyping up his Rakan play when he was playing with Instinct on TSM in 2022. I thought that year was the year that Chime really broke out for me. Instinct as well was really good on that team, but I digress. You know, Chime was really somebody that I was looking at as a big, like, playmaker, somebody that you wanted to move around the map in the mid game and really be this big roam threat, and it just didn't really ever come to fruition in this game on the Rakan. Some of those engages in the back half of the game were quite literally, again, I don't want to use the term game losing because I don't know. We've seen some game-losing mistakes from both of these teams over the course of this series. He didn't make any game-losing plays on their own, but whiffing engages, not being in the right place at the right time, there were definitely some negatives here from Chime in terms of his gameplay, and it's not like Sajed or Surdy or Shaden were really kind of making up for it. Bradley was okay, and, you know, Shaden was still doing damage at the end of the game because it's Brand, and it's basically impossible to not do damage on that champion, but there just wasn't enough. They were never going to be in a good spot unless they got some sort of miracle engage, which they just weren't able to do. Fear is much more clinical in terms of end game execution, and that leads us into Silver Scrapes, game number 5. This is the final game of the series, the final game of the video. Only one of these teams can move on to Sao Paulo, to Los Angeles, to the finals. It can only be one of these teams. The other will have their year ended and presumably will also have their, you know, odds to potentially get into the LCS next year ended. I think a lot of people have forgotten there's going to be that guest spot. That could just be the champion of the summer split. So a big, big, big opportunity for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Fear X Starforge. They are gonna take game number 5. They are gonna take this series 3-2, and this is a very appropriate time for them to have their most dominant game of the series. Wow, this was incredible to watch from Fear. This was a really, really fun draft that they executed incredibly well. The gambit coming in from FlyQuest is we are going to ban out Aurora every single game, and we are going to make sure that if we are on blue side that we will be getting it in game number 5. And guess what? Aurora didn't get to do anything because the big dog was on the other side of this matchup. Nasus is activated. I'm doing like a 180 on this champ, like basically every single time I see him. You know, the moment I start to think that he's like giga bad and like unplayable, then you have a game where he's like genuinely unkillable and there's no way to actually stop him and he actually does well in the early game. And then the moment I start to believe in Nasus and I'm like, oh, there's like real potential here, then he just gets completely shut down because he goes into like somebody who is like very aware of the matchup and comfortable playing into it. And it's like, oh, okay, those were the problems with Nasus in the first place. And the cycle continues forever. But at least Fear was able to get the good version of him in this game. Let me tell you, it was awesome to watch. And Ablaze Olive is going to get player of the game in game number 5 for it. They've relied so much on ABO over the course of this split to kind of be a centralizing figure for a lot of their resources and their pressure in the back half of games, and he delivered once again here. Truly, when I say the Nasus was unkillable, I mean it. He literally just flashed into the middle of FlyQuest, one-shot the Viego in the final fight, and then just couldn't die. Like, there was no way for Fly to do anything from that point onwards. It is so funny to watch Nasus do things. You get the mental advantage of ABO all chatting every single time he got a stack or something in this game. Like, there's just so much going on, but Blaze Olive was great, Nasus was great, and it really helped put Fear over the top. Player of the series, though, as a whole for me, is going to go to Instinct in the bot lane. I thought he was the most important player for Fear across this series. I think ABO has a really strong case to be made that it's him. It should be one of a Blaze Olive or Instinct, in my opinion, but Instinct is going to get it for me. This Caitlyn game was excellent as well. His positioning is exceptional. Like, I don't remember him being this, like, mechanically, like, clean, I would say, in like 2022 and even last year when we were talking about him, even in the promotion tournament. I really wasn't thinking about Instinct as this guy that really excelled in that department. He does a lot of things really well, but that wasn't one of the ones that was like standing out more so than others. But in this series, like, watching him play, this is about as clean mechanically as you could possibly be in a lot of these circumstances, and that is just mega important on champions like Caitlyn, on champions like Jinx, that really need to be in the right spot in order to make the biggest impact. Of course, Nasus is going to grab a lot of the headlines, but Instinct actually did a lot of the groundwork in this game to push Fear over the top. I'd be remiss not to mention Winsome on the Karma. This was a huge support gap in this game, and for Winsome to get his revenge against FlyQuest, actually, there's a lot of former FlyQuest members on Fear. You got Philip as well here. For Winsome to get his revenge on Fly, I think this is really apropos. Instinct obviously also was in the Fly system with FlyFam, but the Karma was really good. Like, Caitlyn Karma, really underrated combo. It doesn't have to be Lux. It never had to be Lux. You just need pressure in the early game. If you can find that out of something else that you are more comfortable on, then go towards that. It clearly worked out here for Fear. XU, I thought, had a really good series, was definitely better than Shaden in the wins. Philip was solid. Top lane was largely irrelevant throughout a lot of this series, but that's fine. That's kind of how things boil down, unless one player just gets absolutely torched, which you're kind of hoping doesn't happen. So congratulations to Fear. This is an amazing accomplishment for an org that has really put in a lot of the legwork in order to get here. I get that this roster is kind of like LCS talent filled, right? Every single player on this team has had at least a decent stint in the LCS. Philip and Instinct kind of being the quote-unquote outliers, even XU, but they were still like playoff players for teams. Instinct made the playoffs in 2022. Philip really stepped in and was very good for FlyQuest, and they've had their time in the spotlight. I understand that there are going to be people that are frustrated about that, but to pretend like this org doesn't deserve to be in the position that they're in, it's ridiculous. I think Fear is exceptional. I'm really excited for this team, and the long-form circumstances that led this team to this point from, the beginning of last year, it's really cool to watch. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, this is heartbreaking. I think this team absolutely anticipated that they, at the very least, would be going to Sao Paulo, that they would be going to Los Angeles to try and compete to be the best team in the NACL, and to not get that chance after being the Spring Split champions, it has to feel pretty deflating. I think a lot of people are going to start pointing fingers, because that's what happens in the League community. A lot of people are going to point fingers at Bradley, but as I've said basically 100 times on this channel, you can never just look at one swap and say one-to-one like that's either the reason the team got better or that's the reason the team got worse. Oftentimes, nothing is black and white like that in League, especially in League esports, but really in League of Legends as a whole. You don't get black and white storylines like that. Typically speaking, there is a lot more going on behind the scenes in terms of communication and just maybe the way that the team wants to play things out. Quad is a very different player from Bradley, and so I'm not just going to sit here and say that Bradley was the problem. I think that there were quite a few things going on, especially because Bradley was pretty good in this playoff run. Done of the game in Game 5 is going to go to Surdy in the top lane. He was largely irrelevant from this series just in general, and that's really not the kind of effect you would hope that he would have. I was really banging the drum for him at the end of the Spring Split. I was talking about him as clearly the best player in the NACL. His highs are just higher than everybody else's. Clearly his mechanical ceiling is ridiculous. You get him on the right LCS team with the right development program, and I think he could be the best top laner in North America within 2 years, but he was largely absent from this series in terms of impact, and that's really just not good enough. Shaden, the scoreline looks better than the individual gameplay here in game number 5. Again, just got instantly deleted in the final fight. Really not ideal. Sajed and Chime had their own set of problems throughout this game, and Chime honestly probably had his worst series of the entire year here in this one against Fear, where Winsome was just the better support. Like, there are positives and negatives, I would say, all things considered, for Fly, but they're definitely going to look at this and feel a bit disappointed. I certainly don't think they have anything to feel disappointed over. I think Fear is an excellent team. I think Dragonsteel is an excellent team, but unfortunately, they're not going to get a chance to defend their title in the finals. That will be left up to Fear x Starforge, who are now not only going to finals to take on Dragonsteel, which is in Los Angeles, which is really cool for a lot of these players, but a lot of them get their first taste of international experience as well as they head to Sao Paulo as they qualified for the Americas Challengers, and that's really, really awesome for Fear. I'm really excited to see what they can do, and honestly, I'm really not counting out this team from being your NACL champions. There was almost nothing stopping them from being able to accomplish that. Dragonsteel has felt impenetrable throughout a lot of this split and throughout a lot of this year, quite frankly, but if there was ever going to be a team to slay the dragon, it very much could be Fear. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL round number 4 overview and analysis video. Only 2 teams remain. Los Angeles awaits for Dragonsteel and Fear x Starforge, as does Sao Paulo with the Americas Challengers Tournament. Congratulations, obviously, to both of these organizations, Maryville, Cincinnati Fear. They have more than earned it over the past couple of years in terms of developing an ecosystem and a foundation that can be built upon. You know, these teams have definitely changed faces. They have definitely changed logos. The 2 big partners coming into the league this split, they're going and they're going to finals. They're going to Sao Paulo. They're going to be the ones that are represented there, which is obviously great for the league, but you gotta give a lot of props to the players. That being said, there can only be one winner. Dragonsteel and Fear x Starforge, only one team can be your 2024 NACL Summer Split champions. If I had to predict, it's really hard to go against what we saw in Winners Finals. Dragonsteel has been untouchable. They are still undefeated in terms of a series score over the course of this year or this split, and it's honestly just really difficult for me to imagine a world in which that ends up changing. Dragonsteel have to be the favorites going into this series, but if anyone can beat them, it absolutely is Fear x Starforge. If they are able to play their own game and get their own style across, they can win that series. We know that that's possible, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that take down in the comment section below. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL, LCS playoffs are wrapping up soon, LCK playoffs are wrapping up soon, and of course, we will be covering the finals here in the NACL, so a lot of fun content to go around. If you are interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all